We are reading A Long Way from Chicago, and we are on chapter 4, 1932. I don't think Grandma's very good influence on us, Mary Alice said. It had taken her a while to come to that conclusion, and I had to agree. It reconciled us some to our trips to visit her. Mary Alice was 10 now. I believe that was the first year she didn't bring her jump rope with her. And she no longer pitched a fit because she couldn't take her best friends, Beverly and Aubrey, to meet Grandma. They wouldn't understand, Mary Alice said. We weren't so sure Mother and Dad would either. Still, we dragged our heels about going, but they didn't notice we looked forward to the trip. What? Since we still dragged our heels about going, they didn't notice that we looked forward to the trip. I get it. The gooseberries were ripe when we got there that August. And come to find out, Grandma's was famous for her gooseberry pies. Mary Alice and I were stemming berries at the kitchen table for that first morning. Grandma was supervising a pan of them on the stove. The gooseberries popped softly as they burst open in the boiling water. Then somebody knocked on the front door. Grandma ran an arm across her forehead and started through the house. We have followed, but she said, "Keep at it." When she came back, Mrs. L. J. Witterbach, the banker's wife, was right behind her. If she thought that she was going to be asked to sit down, she had another think coming. Grandma returned to the stove, leaving Mrs. Wilderbach beached by the kitchen table, where she overlooked Mary Alice and me. She was big on top, though nowhere near as big as Grandma. She had tiny feet teetering in high-heeled shoes. The heat of the kitchen staggered her, but then people from Death Valley would have keeled over in Grandma's kitchen. "Mrs. Dowdle, I am here on a mission," she said, "and I'll come right to the point." "Do that," Grandma said. "As you know, this is County Week Fair," Mrs. Wiedebacher said, "the annual opportunity for our small community to make its mark." Grandma said nothing. "As you recall," Mrs. Wiedebacher said, "my bread and butter pickles have taken the blue ribbon every year since the fair recommenced after the Great War." If Grandma recalled this, she showed no sign. "But my cucumbers this year haven't been up to snuff. Not worth the brine for pickling. How are yours?" "Didn't put any in," Grandma said. "Ah, well, you were wise." Mrs. Wiedenbacher's forehead began to look slick. "It wasn't just the heat. Mrs. Dow, Mrs. Dowdle, I'll come clean. I don't think I better enter my bread and butter pickles this year, and I'm going to tell you why. The depression is upon us, and times are hard." "They never was easy for me," Grandma recalled. "And quite unfairly," Mrs. Wiedenbacher said. "People blame the bankers." "My stars," Grandma said. "The bank foreclosures on people's farm and throws them off their lands, and they don't even appreciate it." "Now, Mrs. Dowdle, don't be like that." Mrs. Wiedenbacher reached down the front of her dress and plucked up a lace handkerchief. She dabbed all around her mouth. "Mr. Wiedenbacher has asked me not to enter my bread and butter pickers into the competition fair this year." "Keep your head down till the depression blows over, huh?" "Something like that," Mrs. Wiedenbacher murmured. "So naturally I thought of you. After all, we've been neighbors these many years." The Wiedenbachers lived at the far end of town in the only brick house. "I said to my husband, Mr. Wiedenbacher, somebody must carry home a blue ribbon to keep our town's name in front of the public. Otherwise, those county seat women will sweep the field." As you know, Mrs. Cowbill's decorative butter pats never do any better than honorable mention. If Grandma knew who won at the county fair, she showed no sign. But there is nobody to touch you for baking with gooseberries. Even those of us who've never had a taste have heard. Word does get around. Try as a person, try as a person will to keep it quiet, Grandma said. "Gooseberries are a tricky thing," Mrs. Wiedenbacher went on. "Now you take Mrs. Volksmeyer's over at Bremont. She wouldn't take on a gooseberry, but she'll pull down the blue ribbon in the fruit pies and cobblers division with her individual cherry tarts if somebody doesn't put a stop to her." Quiet followed as we listened to Grandma's wooden spoon scraping the sides of the stew pan. At length she said, "I cook to eat, not to show off." Mrs. Wiedenbacher sighed. "Mrs. Dowdle, these are desperate times. Don't hide your light under a bushel. It is up to you to hold high the banner for our town." Grandma putting herself out for fame of the town? I thought Mrs. Wiedenbacher was on the wrong track. On the other hand, Grandma did like to win. Growing frantic, Mrs. Wiedenbacher let her gaze skim over Mary Alice and me. And a day at the fair would be a nice outing for your grandkiddies. Wouldn't cut any ice with them, Grandma said. They're from Chicago, so they've seen everything. Instantly, an expression of great boredom fell over Mary Alice's face. I thought she might yawn. She was playing along with Grandma. I'd been thinking a day at the fair would be a welcome change, but I shrugged and went on stemming my gooseberries. Grandma turned slightly from the stove. Wouldn't have any way to get them there if I wanted to go. Mrs. Wiedenberg brightened. I will personally conduct you to the fair on prize day in my Hupmobile. She waved a hand in benediction over us. And there'll be plenty of room for your grandkids. Oh, well, Grandma said, if I have an extra pie and it's not raining that day. Mrs. Dowdle, I knew you would stand and deliver. Mrs. Wiedenbacher clapped her hands. And remember, even the red ribbon for second prize will be better than nothing. Grandma gazed past her, seeming to count the corpses on the flypaper strip. Mrs. Wiedenbacher was dismissed and soon left. We all listened to the powerful roar as she ground her Hupmobile into gear. Grandma's sleeves were already turned back, or she'd be turning them back now, and she pointed at me. Scoot uptown and bring me some 25-pound pack of sugar. Tell them to stick it on my bill. After this, I want every gooseberry off them bushes out back. She turned on Mary Alice. And you're going to learn a thing or two about pie crust. There followed 3 of the busiest days in my young life. Wresting 25 pounds of sugar back from Moore's store was nothing to picking all of those gooseberry bushes clean. As Mrs. Wiedenbacher said, gooseberries are tricky things, sour to the taste and spiky with stickers, not unlike Grandma. My throbbing hands were covered with sticker wounds from getting all the gooseberries into the pail. With towels around their middles and their hair tucked up, Grandma and Mary Alice rolled out endless pastry on big breadboards. We baked gooseberry pie every 4 hours for the next 3 days. I had about all I could do to feed corn cobs into the stove to keep the corn heat hot, even. Gooseberries are so tart that more sugar than fruit goes into the pie. Some pies were still too sour, others gritty with too much sugar. We tried and we tried again. Grandma grew careful about balancing her ingredients, holding the measuring cup up to the light. She was like a scientist seeking the cure for something. I had to go back uptown for more sugar and another big can of Crisco, and we had to sample them all in search of the perfect pie. Mary Alice says she's never since been able to look a gooseberry in the face. The day of judgment came. Mary Alice and I were in the parlor early waiting. Grandma had told us to cover our heads against the fairground sun. I had on a Cubs cap I traveled in, and Mary Alice wore her straw hat from Easter. The house reeked of baking. Then Grandma sailed like a galleon into the front room, striking us dumb. For her, dressing up usually meant taking off her apron. But this morning she wore a ready-made dress covered with flowers. The collar was fine net, fixed with a big cameo brooch that rode high, and on her feet were large, unfamiliar shoes, white with the hint of a heel and the laces tied in pretty, perky bows. On her head was a hat with a big brim. The hatband on it happened to be a blue ribbon. She glared, daring us to pay her a compliment. But the cat had our tongues. Mary Alice stared up at her, transfixed. Was she seeing herself 50 years hence? Don't know what that was. The Hupmobile growled up outside, and the next thing you knew, we were in it. It wasn't as long as Al Capone's big Lincoln limousine, but it was the biggest car in this town. Mary Alice and I had the back seat to ourselves, and the pie was in a box between my feet. Grandma took charge of a small hamper full of our lunch, since they charge you 2 prices for everything at the fair. She rode up front beside Mrs. Wiedenbach with one big elbow propped on the open window. The town had emptied out because this was prize day at the fair. But when we went by the Coffee Pot Cafe, there were faces at the windows, and a loafer or two paused on the sidewalk to see us pass. Grandma inclined her head slightly. Most people wouldn't take their bows until after they'd won a blue ribbon, but Grandma was not most people. The fairground was a pasture along a dusty road this side of the county seat. It was a collection of sheds and tents and a grandstand for harness racing. But this was the big day for judging cattle, quilts, and cookery, so the grounds were packed, though it was a nickel to get in. Mrs. Wiedenbach twinkled along in her high heels next to Grandma. She didn't dare show her pickles, but she wanted some reflective glory in case the gooseberry pie won. Let's run that pie over to the domestic sciences tent and get it registered, she said. I don't want it setting around, Grandma said. The livestock draw flies. The pie was no burden to Grandma because I was carrying it. Let's see something at the fair first, she said, and managed to sound uninterested. Along the midway, the Anti Horse Theft Society had a stand selling boogaroo and roasting ears. I don't know what that is. The 4-H Club was offering chances on a heifer, that's a cow. Alias Calmers had a big tent showing there's huskers and combines. That's farming equipment. Prohibition was about to be repealed, but the temperance people had another big tent offering ice water inside and a stage out front with a quartet performing. We stopped to hear them. At the other end of the midway was a rickety Ferris wheel, a merry-go-round, and a caterpillar. Beyond it was a sight that drew me. In an open stubble field, a biplane stood. Beside it was a pilot in a leather helmet with goggles and pooties wrapped around his leg. I'm going to have to look that one up. And a sign, Barney Buchanan, Ace Air Trick Flying and Passenger Rides. My heart skipped a beat and sank. Another sign said, Ride 75 cents. I didn't have that kind of money on me. I didn't have any money on me. Still, my heart began to taxi. I'd never been in a plane, and my hero was Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh, who'd flown the Atlantic alone. The American Legion was sponsoring Barney Buchanan. A red-faced man in a Legionnaires' cap brawled through the megaphone. Tell you what I'm going to do, folks. Any minute now, Mr. Buchanan is going to show us his stuff by putting his machine through the same maneuvers he used in the Great Wars against the wily Hun. Then, if you think 6 bix is a bit too steep, Mr. Buchanan has agreed to make a special prize day offering. To every blue ribbon winner, Mr. Buchanan will give a ride in his plane, Gratias. That means free of charge, ladies and gentlemen. My heart left the ground, skimmed a hedgerow, and sailed into the wild blue yonder. The pie in my hands would win first prize, since nobody but Grandma would take a chance with gooseberries. But she'd let me have her plane ride because she was too big and too old. You reckon that thing will get off the ground? She said doubtfully, building my hopes even higher. It looks like a box kite, Mary Alice said. A person would have to be nuts to go up in it. The biped's wings were canvas covered and much patched. It was more rickety than the Ferris wheel. Still, it was a plane, and it looked like my one chance in a life to go up in one. Now Mrs. Wiedenbach was plucking at Grandma's arm, and it was time to enter the pie into the competition. When we four went to the domestic sciences tent, Grandma remarked, I said there'd be flies. Surrounded by clouds, long tables were all laid out. Jams and preserves, vegetables in novelty shapes, cakes and breads. A half-sized cow carved out of butter reclined on a block of melting ice. It was as hot as Grandma's kitchen in the tent, so people fanned paper fans, compliments of Brochure's funeral home. Each one had the brochure motto printed on it. When you come to the end, you'll find a friend. Mrs. Wiedenbach averted her eyes as we passed pickled products. I took charge of unpacking the pie and getting it registered at Fruit Pies and Cobblers. Grandma stared at the other end of the table, casting an eye over the competition. Everything looked good to me, and I was wishing I was a judge so I could have a taste. A little card with the number and the name stood beside each entry. When she got to her own pie, Grandma froze. Next to it was another, lattice-topped gooseberry pies. There was no doubt about it. Only gooseberries are that shade of gray-green. And it was a very nice-looking pie. The edges of its pastry were neatly crimped as Grandma's. Maybe better. She bent to read the card and whipped around. I followed her look as she fell on one of the smallest people in the tent. It was a man, one of the few there. A little tiny man. He wore small bib overalls, a dress shirt, and a bow tie. 4 or 5 strands of hair were arranged across his little bald head. Rupert Pennypacker, Grandma breathed. You seldom saw her caught off guard. Was he responsible for the other gooseberry pie? Who? I said. The best home baker in the state of Illinois, Grandma said. Him and me come up together in the last county, so I know. Mrs. Wiedenbacher quaked. Even Mary Alice looked concerned. I'm a goner, said Grandma. A puttering sound deafened us, and it was Barney Buchanan, the air ace, right over our heads. He was doing his aerial stunts, barrel rolls and vertical figure eights, or whatever he did. Everybody looked up, though we could only see the tent. It was just a moment, but somehow I'm sure in that split second when we'd all looked up, I thought Grandma had switched her pies card with Rupert Pennypackers. It was a desperate act, but as Mr. Wiedenbacher had said, these were desperate times. It was the wrong thing for Grandma to do, but I might get a plane ride out of it. My head swam. Grandma nudged me away from the table and elbowed through the parting crowd. She was making for Mr. Pennypacker, and I wondered if she'd reach down, grab him by his bib, and fling him out of the tent. With Grandma, you never knew. Rupert, she said. Standing beside him was the scariest looking old lady I'd ever seen, weirder than Aunt Puss Chapman. She was only a little taller than Mr. Pennypacker and dressed all in black, including the veil on her hair. She had warts and her chin met her hat brim. There was a lump on her cheek that looked like it might be a bunch of chaw. You remember Mamma, Mr. Pennypacker said to Grandma. His voice was high, like it had never changed. My voice hadn't changed either, but I was 12, so I still had hope. His old mamma hissed something in his ear and tried to pull him away with a claw on his arm. Well, may the best man win, Grandma said, turning on her heel. By now the judges were at work. They carried little silver knives and miniature trowels for sampling the cobblers and the pies. Tensions mounted. Nervously, Mrs. Wiedenbacher said to Grandma, what a nice moist consistency your pie filling has, Miss Dowdle. I'm sure it will be noted. How much water did you add to the mixture? About a mouthful, Grandma replied. The judging went on forever, but nobody left the sweltering tent. We all watched the judges chewing. Finally, Mary Alice said she thought she might faint, so I took her outside. Up among the clouds, Barney Buchanan was still puttering his old biplane through its paces. He dived to earth and then pulled up in time. He gave us 3 loops and a snap roll, and my heart was up there with him, scouting for Germans. A voice rolled from inside the tent, followed by the gusts of applause. They were announcing the winners. Honorable mention, third prize, second prize, first prize. I didn't want to go back in there. I'd hoped we win, but I wasn't sure we should, not if Grandma had switched. The tent quivered with one final burst of applause. People began streaming out, flowering around us, and then strolled Mr. Pennypacker and his mamma, clutching him. You couldn't read anything in that face of hers, but Mr. Pennypacker was beaming. From the clasp of his overall bib hung a blue ribbon. Shoot, Mary Alice said. After all that pie crust, I rolled off. In a way, I was relieved. But then I saw my one and only chance for a plane ride crash and burn. Mr. Pennypacker was already heading for the field where the biplane was coming in for a landing. At last, Mrs. Wiedenbach and Grandma came out. A nod from Grandma sent me back to the Hupmobile for our hamper of lunch. We ate it at the table in the temperance tent, sliced chicken washed down with ice water. Grandma had had her great stone face on, but Miss Wiedenbacher tried to make the best of things. Never mind, Mrs. Dowdle. As I have said, a red ribbon for second place is not to be sneezed or scorned at. You did all right. But Grandma hadn't come to the fair for second prize. She didn't wear it, if she'd bothered to collect it at all. You were up against stiff competition, Mrs. Wiedenbach said. I dare say Rupert Pennypacker has had nothing to do all of his life but wait on his dreadful mother and bake. Consoling Grandma was a thankless task. She ate her chicken sandwich with her usual appetite, observing the crowds. If I could read her mind at all, she was thinking that she could do with a cold beer. The day seemed to have peaked and was going downhill now. As we left the temperance tent, the quartet was singing in close harmony. We were ready to head for the parking pasture, but Grandma turned us the other way toward the midway and the biplane. What? Said Miss Wiedenbach, but fell silent. We were walking through the fair, and something inside my rib cage began to stir. There ahead, the biplane was on the ground. Afternoon sun played off the dull mahogany of its propeller. Something within me dared to dream. I wasn't swooping. I didn't even dare taxi, but I was walking lighter. Giving blue ribbon runners free rides hadn't stimulated much business. Bernie Buchanan was lounging beside his plane, and he was smoking another cigarette in a cupped hand, pilot style. Grandma strode past the ticket table out onto the field, and she paused to look at the plane from prop to tail, and then she glanced down briefly at me. I didn't dare look up at her, but my hopes were rising, and then she marched forward. With Bernie Buchanan, Grandma sobbed. When Bertie Buchanan saw Grandma bearing down on him, he tossed away his cigarette. I'm a blue ribbon winner, Grandma announced. Here for my ride. What? Miss Wiedenbacher said. My brain went dead. Well, ma'am, said Buchanan uncertainly, noticing your size. And what class did you compete in? Fruits, pies, and cobblers. She held up a crumpled blue ribbon clutched in her fist. and she gave him a glimpse of it and then dropped the ribbon into her pocketbook. Well, ma'am, seems to me I've already given a ride to the man who won first prize. In pies, she said. A little fellow. Oh, that's Rupert Pennypacker, Grandma said. You got that turned around in your mind. He won in the sausage and head cheese. Don't I look more like a pie baker than him? Grandma reached up to pull the pin out of her hat, and she handed her hat to Mary Alice. Here, hold this. It might blow off. I saw the hat band was missing from her hat. The blue ribbon. It took 3 big members of the American Legion and Bernie Buchanan to get Grandma into the front cockpit of the plane. Eventually, the sight drew a crowd. The Legionnaires would invite Grandma to step into their clasped hands and then boost her up. That didn't work. Then they'd hoist her up some other way, but she'd get halfway there and her hindquarters would be higher than her head. They had an awful job getting her into the plane, and they were wringing wet. But at last she slid into the seat to a round of applause from the crowd. Grandma was a tight fit, and the plane seemed to bend beneath her. Bernie Buchanan stroked his chin, but then he pulled his goggles over his eyes and sprang up to the rear seat. He could pilot the plane from there, if he could see around Grandma. A Legionnaire jerked the propeller, and the motor coughed twice, and then roared. Mrs. Wiedenbacher was between Mary Alice and me now, clutching her hands. A lot of Grandma stuck up above the plane. The breeze stirred her white hair, loosening the bun on her back. A spectacle lenses, her spectacle lenses flashed like goggles. She raised one hand in farewell, and the plane began to bump down the field. Now my heart was in my mouth. Everyone's was. The biplane, heavy burden, lumbered over uneven ground, trying to gather speed. It drew nearer and nearer the hedgerow at the far end of the field. Lift! The cried crowd. Lift! Lift! Mary Alice's hands were over her eyes. But the distant ducks spurted from the plane's front wheels. The tail rose but dropped down again. It had stopped just short of the hedge grove, and now it was turning back. We watched the bright disk of the whirling propeller at the biplane return to us. Bernie Buchanan dropped down from the cockpit, and he looked pale and shaken. Boy, did he need a cigarette. But they had to get Grandma down from the plane, and getting her out was twice the job of getting her in. She'd plant one big shoe on the shoulder and the other on another, and they had her by the ankles, then by the hips. She tripped forward and back, and the pocketbook swinging from her arm pummeled their heads. She brought 2 big men to their knees. At last she was on solid ground, scanning the crowd for me. She cocked a finger, and I went forth, and as always, I couldn't see a moment ahead. I'm going to pause for just 1 second here. Ma'am, I'm sorry, Bernie Buchanan was saying to Grandma, but I was just carrying a little more freight than this old crate could handle. Grandma waved that away. Don't give it a thought. You can take my grandson instead, she said, if he wants to go. The heavens opened. I thought I heard celestial music. Somehow I was up in the front seat of the plane, buckling myself in with trembling hands, and Bernie Buchanan was handing me up a pair of goggles. Goggles from the Great War. I'm going to pause here for just 1 moment. And now we were taxiing, Barney and me bumping over the ground, gathering up speed behind the yearning motor, and I felt that moments we left the ground and the fair fell away below us, and ahead of us was nothing but the towering white clouds, and beyond them sky, endless sky. I didn't know there was that much sky. As we flew, Barney and me, in stuttering circles, higher than the birds, over the patchwork fields. That night Mary Alice went up to bed early, tuckered out. Still in her fair finery, Grandma sat in the platform rocker, working out of her shoes. They'd been a torment to her all day, and now she kicked them aside. If I could pop all these corns on my toes, she said, I could feed a famine. I'd settle on the settee, watching her in the circle of the light after the big doings of the day. Grandma, I said at last, I have a couple of things on my mind. Well, spit 'em out, she said, if you must. About your plane ride. You never did expect it to get off the ground, did you? Oh, lands, no, she turned down her hand. When I was dainty enough for a plane to lift, they didn't have 'em. You couldn't have dusted the crops with me on board. I just wanted to see what it felt like sitting up there in the hen roost. Cockpit, Grandma, I said. Then you meant for me to have the ride all along. Grandma didn't reply. And another thing. I've got a confession to make, I said. I know you wanted first place on the prize. You wanted it bad. And I thought you switched the card on Mr. Pennypecker's pie with yours so you could win with his pie. She shot me her sternest look. But then, easing back into the platform rocker, she said, I did. And that was the end of the year 1932.